I'm happy to have this opportunity, and I first want to acknowledge my co-authors. So David Hahn is the engineer that's working with me. Daniel Smith is at James Cook University. Jonathan Lin is at MIT, and Alan Ball is at the COMET program here at UCAR. So also we have a number of partnerships and different institutions that are involved in this effort. And Res3, which is one of our partners, which I'll talk about, also has their partners. So just to give some context, let's talk for a minute about the U.S. hurricane problem. So in Hurricane Irma, this was the largest evacuation in U.S. history. There were 6.8 million people who were estimated to have evacuated. Only about 5% of those went to the state designated shelters. And most of the people actually evacuated out of state, which for many people was hundreds of miles or more. About 3 million out of that 6.8 million were not from official evacuation zones, although some of them may have been in vulnerable areas. But this is very interesting. And the people who are not in these mandatory evacuation zones but choose to evacuate are called shadow evacuees. And so this highlights a problem in the US that oftentimes the people who are told to evacuate don't, and some of the people who maybe don't need to evacuate end up evacuating. Well, why is this a problem? Well, these shadow evacuees consume a lot of valuable resources such as transit capacity and fuel. The congestion can discourage those who need to evacuate from doing so. But also these people could be putting themselves at risk of death due to traffic accidents. So it turns out in the US, traveling by car has been getting safer, but a lot of these evacuations happen by personal automobile, and the rate of fatality is 1.22 per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. So if you just get 6.8 million people and put 3 people per car and have them drive 500 miles to an evacuation site and then back, then you would expect about 27 people will die in accidents just if this were under normal conditions. So on a per person basis, this doesn't seem very high. It's a 1 in 323,000 chance of death. And it's somewhat safer than going skydiving. And I just put that as a point of comparison because many people consider skydiving to be a somewhat risky activity. In Hurricane Rita, though, this highlighted what can happen in a chaotic evacuation. And there we had about 2.5 to 3.5 million people who evacuated. And there were about between 80 and 120 deaths that were attributed during the evacuation itself, while only 7 direct deaths were due to the storm. So this was about a 1 in 29,000 risk of if you participated in that evacuation. So if you think about when people are making this decision to evacuate, what do they really need to know? Many people will go to the National Hurricane Center and they will look at this product, which is the cone of uncertainty. And for many people, they'll look at this and maybe 1 or 2 other things, and then they'll leave after a minute or 2. And that apparently gave them what they were looking for. But this doesn't tell you really anything about direct impacts. It just tells you some general aspects about the storm and where it might be. So if you think about what people actually need to know, they need to know questions like, is it safe to stay in their house? When are the winds and the floods and the storm surge going to arrive? How high is it going to be? How much damage will they experience at their house? How long will the power be out? And so the answers to these questions really depends on their specific vulnerability and situation. And I apologize, I think I'm in the wrong, I may be in the wrong. Okay, I just wanted to check. I wanted to make sure I'm in the right presentation. Okay, so going back into here. So we're trying to treat this probabilistic risk framework in a formal sense. So we're having the wind hazard, which includes probabilistic hazard information. We're treating structural vulnerability, which depends on the characteristics of their house, the vulnerability of the surrounding structures, and also whether there's large trees and whatnot around them. And then there's exposure, which is their physical dwelling, but not just the cost of their house and the contents, but also their opportunity cost of lost time, the lives of their family members, and their livelihood. So if you think about how to do this, how can we approach this? Well, the concept of the hurricane risk calculator is to intersect the modeled wind hazard at the user's specific location with their structural vulnerability specific to their house. And what's important is to identify the key wind thresholds, such as tree damage, power outages, minor damage, major structural damage, or complete failure of their structure, and then calculate the probability of each of these consequences. And then you have to translate this into some form that's understandable and actionable. So an example could be shelter in place, or evacuate to a local shelter, or put up your storm shutters by 3 p.m. tomorrow. These are all actionable type of communications. And then we want to disseminate this to users directly through decision support tools and alerts, say through a mobile app or through email or whatever venue they choose. So just to talk briefly about the probabilistic wind modeling. So this is a system called Forecast of Hurricanes using Large Ensemble Output, and this has been devised by MIT, Kerry Emanuel and his graduate student Jonathan Lin. And what they've done, they're using the large scale global ensemble outputs as well as the tracks, and they are incorporating the internal variability from these models. So they bootstrap up synthetic track models, and they're also sampling the environment and then plugging this into a very simple intensity emulator, and then they're able to run a surface wind model and get outputs. So this has been running at NCAR for over a year now and has been working pretty well. Here's an example from Hurricane Delta earlier this fall. And so you can see there's 1,000 different intensity forecasts here showing the wide range of scenarios that are being simulated with all the different uncertainty. And then here's an example of the probabilistic wind output. So this is for Hurricane Iota a few weeks ago and down in Nicaragua, this town on the coast. And the upper graph is basically a probability density function of the expected wind speed in time. And the lower graph is a cumulative density function. And so what you can see is that this system is able to provide guidance and output for even very high wind speeds. So in this case, it was saying that this town had about a 25% chance of getting 50 meter per second sustained winds. Okay, let's talk about how the vulnerability is assessed, because this is also another key aspect. Our partner, Resilient Residents, has devised a assessment app, which is based on structural engineering. They've developed this for Florida and Queensland, and this is basically based on a lot of years of research that they've been doing. But essentially, it asks the homeowner 24 different questions about the characteristics of their house. So there's questions about the outside in their house, the type of windows and openings in their house. There's a lot of questions about the roof and the shape of it and how it's attached to the walls. And there's also some behavioral questions, such as a past storm experience and whether people usually prepare for hurricanes. And out of these different responses, they come up with individual group scores and then one overall resilience score that's on a scale of 1 to 5. So here's just an example of how this works for windows. They'll ask the homeowner which window type best matches the majority of windows in your house, and there'll be a bunch of graphical depictions of the different types of windows. And so the homeowner can select one there. And then they'll also ask, do you have protection for your windows? So there's an option to have no protection or to have plywood or roller shutters, etc. And then based on that, behind the scenes, each of these responses is scored for wind, debris, water ingress, and storm surge. And they're all done on a 1 to 5 scale. And it's based on expert engineering judgment, claims analysis, and damage investigations. And so they will basically group all these together and come up with a score for each component of the house. And then they'll provide information to the homeowners about why it's important for resilience and some tips on how they can improve the resilience of that component. So the end result is that the homeowner gets this nice little report, and they will get a resilience level score for their house. So the hurricane risk calculator is then going to take that and combine it with the real-time predicted wind hazard and come up with risk and translate that and communicate that. So here's kind of a 8th generation version of what we're thinking about of how to communicate the risk of wind damage. And so the first thing to keep in mind is that right now the tool is just for wind damage. So it's very important to let the homeowner know that we're not including storm surge, flood inundation, other types of hazards. And it's also a key to remind them of their elevation. So the tool geolocates based on their provided address and will tell them their elevation. And finally, the tool will reiterate to them that they should follow all local evacuation orders. So the scale is devised in also a 5-point scale, but we've tried to use categorical or qualitative descriptors and also colors. So the first one is really this minimal area of risk, and that's where they have a very low risk of damaging winds. So this is meant to just highlight awareness, but they're not really expecting any type of damage. It's possible that their lawn furniture may get blown around. The next scale is kind of above that because there is some chance of damage. They may get some damage to outbuildings or their shingles, for instance, but their structure is expected to be habitable. And this is key, that we're also trying to convey not just the risk of damage, but whether their house will be habitable after the storm, because that can really impact decisions for evacuation as well. But the bottom line for this level is that there's little to no significant structure expected. Once they get into elevated, this is where they're really kind of in that gray area where they're now expecting at least some minor damage and some major damage like roof damage and siding damage is possible. And the structure could be uninhabitable due to water damage or loss of services. The severe is where the damage starts really getting higher. So, for instance, there could be a loss of most of the roof structure, some exterior walls. That's the type of language we're trying to convey. And it's likely that the structure will be uninhabitable. Finally, the extreme risk output for wind damage basically conveys that they could have total roof failure and wall collapse, and their house is basically going to be a total loss, or it's very likely to be. Okay, let's briefly review where the risk calculator is at currently. We have built a demonstration web app, and this is what you would see if you log in to the home screen of the app. And so the first area is that the homeowner can fill out this RESRI structural vulnerability assessment and get their personalized risk outputs. We also have a storm map that just shows where the different storms are, which is fully zoomable, so the user can zoom down and see where their house is in relation to the storm. And we have the wind hazard capability now built in. There's a navigation which homeowners can use. And this has all been devised in Amazon Web Service using serverless architecture, so it's very scalable and it should be highly available. And it's getting close to release. We're planning to test it very soon in Australia, which I'll mention more about in a minute. But here's an example for Hurricane Beta earlier this year. So the storm had already moved inland at this time, and there's an example of a user's location in Galveston, Texas. And in this case, the wind threat to Galveston was quite low. So they had only like a 25% chance of 30 knot winds. But this just illustrates what a user would be able to see during this. So for the next steps in the project, we're going to alpha test this during the Australian cyclone season, which is just about to start. And we'll run this through April to May next year. And then we want to do a more wide-scale beta test here in the US next hurricane season. In terms of future development, we want to add additional risk outputs because we know that the risk of power outage is very important for evacuation decisions. It's also important for people on medical equipment, et cetera. The risk of injury and death is also a really key thing, but it's going to take a lot of work to get there because we're going to need to have good disaster epidemiology data. Financial damage would be of high interest to the risk industry. Comparison of risks. This is over here on the right shown. This is meant to be an evacuation decision support tool that basically shows users their different options. So they would be able to input options. So the default would be to shelter in place at their house, and that would convey the risk. And in this case, this hypothetical example is very high. But they would also have the option to maybe go inland 10 miles and shelter at a friend's house. That might have a lower risk. Or they could evacuate to a local shelter, which would be, in this case, the safest of all options because the risk is just similar to a daily commute, just driving 20 miles. or they might be contemplating evacuation to long distance locations, such as a relative's house. So the idea here is to tell them what their risks are and contextualize it in terms of some common things that they would help them to understand what that risk is. And then finally, we want to incorporate the social science into the tool. This is very critical. We have a pending proposal on that, and we want to integrate this with the emergency management. And eventually, you could imagine that this tool could provide personalized evacuation recommendations under the guidance of their local emergency managers. And then finally, of course, we want to incorporate all the different hurricane-related hazards, storm surge, inland flooding, etc. So as more people download this and undertake the structural vulnerability assessment, then we'll be able to start to compare what the tool predicts to what's actually happening on the ground from damage assessment data. So we're looking forward to this and calibrating the tool. And just to sum up, to end, what we've basically tried to do is make a user-focused tool for impact-based warnings. So we start with the user needs, and then we build a probabilistic risk framework accounting for the physical hazard modeling and the vulnerability assessment. And then at the top here, this really key aspect is translation and decision support tools for effective alerting. So we have a researcher collective, which has about 34 researchers currently, and we're welcoming people who would like to contribute. And I'll just end with this slide, different ways to partner. We're looking for governmental partners and NGOs, as well as commercial partners, and there's a number of different ways you can get involved. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. As you'll see in the